It is time.
All civilization begins with theocracy and ends with democracy. Since our brains evolved the capacity to produce them, we have had questions. Questions about the world around us, questions about ourselves and our role in that world, questions about what might lie beyond the world we can see and hear and touch. Our most fundamental trait as a species is our curiosity. We seek, we ask, we wonder. And for the vast majority of our existence as a species, thousands of years, the conclusions we have come to about so many of those questions is, God did it.
Good idea, O Lord.
Of course it's a good idea.
Why does the sky erupt in light and sound? That's Zeus, god of thunder. Why does the ocean rise up in great waves to sink our ships? That's Poseidon, god of the sea. Why does winter come and kill our crops and livestock? That's Demeter, goddess of the harvest, mourning the yearly loss of her daughter Persephone. We strive to make sense of the world, and when the answers to our questions do not come readily, we invent stories. Sedna's father cut off her fingers, which turned into seals and whales. There were once 10 sons, but they burned the earth with their heat, and Ho-Yi shot all but one of them down. Thoth played drafts with Khonsu the moon, gambling for enough light for Nut to give birth, and that's why the length of the year does not align with the lunar cycle. In our modern lives, most people live in or near cities where light pollution masks all but the brightest of stars, and weather and seismic forecasts help us avoid natural disasters, and vaccines allow us to live without fear of many diseases. But prior to industrialization and modern medicine and computers, human lives were ruled by forces beyond our control. It's very easy to believe in gods when the night sky above you is awash in light. That band of stars is clearly Nut, mother of Isis and Osiris. It's very easy to believe in gods when mountains tremble and spew fire. That volcano is clearly home to Hephaestus or Pele. It's very easy to believe in gods when smallpox or the Black Death or leprosy or cholera ravage your community. These illnesses are clearly the work of Xolotl or Sopona, and you must pray to Asclepius or Parnashivari to be healed. But what's very fascinating to me is that there is one why that religions do not seek to answer. Why do we have religions? This is because fundamentally, paradoxically, the purpose of religion is to end questioning, to end curiosity. Why does the sun rise in the east? God did it. Why do the crops grow? God did it. Why does it rain? God did it. Why do we die? God did it. Wait a minute, but why did God do all of that? Now that sounds like heretic talk, so why don't you back the fuck up unless you want us to go all stabby, Bernie.
The Inquisition. What a show. The Inquisition. Here we go.
This may seem reductive, and certainly different religious traditions have different views on questioning dogma or even apostasy, and there are many spiritual traditions that don't even invoke gods at all. But all of these traditions, at the end of the day, boil down to choosing the easy answer to the hard questions, choosing the compelling story over the messy truth. A Buddhist's approach may feel more in line with modern progressive values than a hardcore fundamentalist Christian's, but belief in reincarnation is still a belief in a supernatural process with no basis in fact. It's belief in a story. Every religion is a collection of stories, and from those stories come ritualized practices and prayers. But those stories do not tell you how a religion arose in the first place. Jewish tradition tells that Moses founded the religion in leading his people out of slavery in Egypt to settle in the promised land of Israel.
Let my people go!
But that clashes with archaeology and recorded history. There is no textual or archaeological evidence that Egypt ever practiced chattel slavery on the same scale the United States did, and certainly there is no evidence of a large Jewish population living along the Nile, even as an underclass. We have never found any evidence of people walking along the bed of the Red Sea, nor of any of the other miracles ascribed to Moses. So how did Judaism come about? Well, while there were never any Jews in Egypt, There were once Egyptians in Judea. During the reign of Ramesses the Great, the pharaoh most often associated with the Exodus story, Egypt's territory included the Levant, extending all the way into modern Lebanon and Syria. Now, eventually, the Egyptians retreated back to their core lands along the Nile, but that memory of being colonized by a mighty empire likely stuck with the ancient Levantines. The people who would come to be known as Hebrews or Jews were one of several Canaanite tribes living in that area who worshipped a diverse pantheon of gods. And that promised land, being at the crossroads of 3 continents, was often a battleground contested by larger empires. The most important of these conquests was that of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, who destroyed the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem and forced the Hebrews living there to migrate to Babylon and assimilate. Those migrants who held on to their traditions needed a way to justify continuing to believe in their chief god, Yahweh. In that time in the Middle East, it was quite common to believe that gods lived in specific places, which was why each culture had their own god. Having been ripped away from their land and thus their god, those Judeans had to change their belief into a universal god, a singular god who was everywhere, and that all the other gods that different cultures worshipped didn't exist. This was the birth of truly monotheistic Judaism as we know it today.
They say that God in heaven is everybody's God.
And those newly monotheistic Jews edited their sacred texts to reflect this new belief. Old verses were changed and new verses were added, trying to suggest that Jews had been monotheistic all along, and that no other gods had ever existed. Most Christians believe that Christianity was founded by Jesus of Nazareth of the house of David, Son of God and Messiah. Except, as I mentioned in the previous video, there are no primary sources attesting to his existence. It is entirely possible that there never was a man named Jesus, or rather Yeshua, as he would have been named in Hebrew. And if he did exist, he certainly never walked on water or brought anyone back from the dead. He would have just been one of many firebrand rabbis during the Roman period shouting in the temple square that God's judgment was nigh and to repent your sins before the world was destroyed. So who actually founded Christianity? That would be St. Paul, who wrote copiously. His letters to various cities have been preserved in the Christian New Testament, and he traveled extensively, preaching his beliefs and practices. And what he preached was part of a larger trend in that time in the Middle East of religious syncretism with Greco-Roman traditions. Christianity is a mishmash of Jewish and Greek belief. The New Testament was originally written in Greek, not Hebrew or Aramaic. Christians are not compelled to circumcise nor follow any other of the Jewish sanitary or sartorial laws prescribed in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Christians from the get-go were allowed to eat pork and shellfish and wear garments of mixed fabrics because St. Paul knew there was no way Hellenistic pagans were going to join his fun new religion if they had to follow all those rules. And in the decades that followed, as Christianity spread, the life and miracles of Jesus were conceived and codified in the Gospels. The Catholic Church, to this day the largest Christian sect, was not founded in 30 AD with a resurrected Jesus investing St. Peter as Pope as they claim. It was founded in 325 with the Council of Nicaea. At the time there were many different Christianities, plural, each with different beliefs about this guy they were calling Jesus the Christ. Some believed he was fully a man, others fully a god, others some mix of both. There were also a whole host of other dogmatic disagreements which I will not get into here. The key takeaway is that this gathering of early Christians voted on what dogma to accept as valid and which religious texts to canonify as part of their New Testament. The Christian Bible was written and compiled by men, not God. This new church became the sole spiritual and moral authority in the Roman Empire, with the Pope, then first among equals of several patriarchs, taking a throne in Rome right next door to the emperor. Or rather, where the emperors used to live, as while this was all happening, the capital was moved to Constantinople. As the Roman Empire changed and eventually started to disintegrate, the 5 patriarchs of Rome, Constantinople, and 3 other cities that don't particularly matter, increasingly came into contention tension with each other. Goths sacked and took control of Rome, leaving the empire to exist only in the east, based around Constantinople. Thus, the two firsts among equals kept trying to assert their supremacy, one claiming right of the motherland of Italy, the other claiming right of the actual imperial seat in Asia Minor. All of this came to a head in 800. The Byzantines had crowned a woman, Irene of Athens, as Emperor of Rome in Constantinople, and Pope Leo III took this opportunity to exert his authority and crown his own Emperor of Rome in Rome, Charlemagne. This division would not be formalized for another 200 years, but this was the beginning of what we today call the schism between the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox churches. Not wanting a woman to rule the empire was at the time a political convenience, but it speaks to the patriarchy and misogyny that has largely defined Western Christianity. The rise of Islam would largely be a threat to the Byzantines and their Eastern Orthodoxy, and with the Muslim armies threatening Constantinople herself, the Roman Empire that was no longer in Rome petitioned the Rome that no longer ruled an empire for help, and the Pope and the Catholic lords of Europe were more than happy to venture to the Holy Land, not to actually help the Byzantines, but to raise their esteem in the church's, and by extension God's, eyes, and to snatch some land for themselves. While the Crusades would ultimately fail, with the Caliphate and later the Ottomans taking control over not just the Holy Land but the remaining Roman Empire, Catholicism in Western Europe was never particularly threatened by Islam, apart from Spain and Portugal, who would end up making a whole thing out of it. The true threat to Catholicism would come from within, from a new invention, the printing press. Heretics and apostates and even anti-popes had rebelled against the papacy all throughout the 1,000+ years of its existence, but each time the Mother Church had snuffed them out and persisted. But because Martin Luther's 95 Theses could be quickly printed and thus distributed en masse, suddenly it was not just bored monks in monasteries thinking heretical thoughts, but whole villages full of peasants who had only recently started to become literate. The Catholic Church still exists today, and it is still by far the largest single Christian sect, but it does not wield the power it once did. Luther and the printing press broke it, and the world forever changed. The invention of printing was the greatest event in history. It was the primal revolution. It was the renewed and renovated form of expression of humanity. It is human thought laying off one form and assuming another. It is the entire and final changing of the skin of that symbolic serpent which ever since Adam has represented intellect. These are the words of Victor Hugo, a writer and politician in post-revolutionary France. He was very concerned with religion and its place in society, as well as the means by which humanity expressed ideas. Both of those concepts were central to the French Revolution. In the first years after they guillotined Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the state religion of France was atheism, and Notre Dame de Paris was converted into a temple of reason. At that time, architecture was viewed by many as symbols of the old, of feudalism, of papal supremacy, of oppression and cruelty. The Bastille, the old castle of the king that served as a horrible prison, was torn down brick by brick. Not a stone of it remains standing today. There is but an empty plaza and a bronze obelisk marking where it once loomed over Paris. France commemorates that act of demolition as their most important state holiday, Bastille Day, every July 14th. A similar fate almost befell Notre Dame, as in the decades following the revolution, it was used to host parties and store supplies, and was allowed to fall into disrepair. Well, Victor took issue with that and decided to write a book about it. Hugo was well aware of the symbolic status of Notre Dame and the Bastille and what they represented to the people of France, but he also recognized their importance as markers of history. His argument was that prior to the printing press, it was architecture that was used to express ideas. Buildings were the books of the ancient world, structures that would far outlive their architects, standing tall for all to see for centuries or even millennia. Architecture was, up to the 15th century, the chief register of humanity, that during this space of time no idea of any elaboration appeared in the world without being built into masonry, that every popular idea as well as every religious law has had its monument in fact, that the human race has never had an important thought which it has not written in stone. And why? It is because every thought, whether religious or philosophic, is interested in its own perpetuation, because an idea which has stirred one generation desires to stir others, and to leave its trace. Now, what a precarious immortality is that of the manuscript! How far more solid, lasting, and enduring a book is a building. Notre Dame de Paris, better known in English as The Hunchback of Notre Dame, is essentially half a novel of fiction and half an essay arguing for the preservation of historical architecture. Honestly, if Hugo were alive today, he would have loved YouTube. He'd be out here making a video essay about how the internet killed books and it would have millions of views. Because there's a bit of irony reading this book, arguing that books killed architecture, especially now in our current age where film and computers and the World Wide Web are doing a similar thing to books in turn. I'll wager of the people living today, far more have seen the various film adaptations of Hunchback or watched YouTube videos talking about it than have actually read the book, which honestly is a bit of a shame as it's a pretty damn good one. This proves, moreover, that one may be a great genius and yet understand nothing of other people's art. In between his vivid descriptions of 15th century Paris and its Gothic architecture, Victor Hugo tells the story of several characters. There is Claude Frollo, the archdeacon of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, his easygoing brother Jehan, who keeps hitting him up for money, the titular hunchback Quasimodo, who rings the bells of the church, the poet Gringoire, who serves as a sort of author insert, Phoebus, captain of the guard, who is a shitty man-whore who is terrible and you should hate him, and of course Esmeralda, who is of the Romani people. Before going further, let me address this point. This word that I am showing on screen right now is a slur. The people it refers to call themselves Roma or Romani, and that is how I will refer to them. However, this slur is used quite frequently in Hugo's novel and in every adaptation of the work, as that is the word that would have been used at the time to describe these people. I am not going to censor that word, whether in clips from a film or in quotations that I read myself. This is to preserve the integrity of the original work. Just know that it is not a word that should ever be spoken or written in any other context. Both the French and English versions of this word derive from Egyptian, as Europeans of the Middle Ages believed these foreigners were hailing from the land of the Nile. However, the Romani people actually come originally from the Indian subcontinent. They slowly made their way across Europe during the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, where they tended to be met with suspicion, due to their dark skin, unfamiliar language, nomadic lifestyle, and strange religious practices, at least for Europe. In order to make money, they would often perform as entertainers, dancing and juggling, and also fortune-telling, most famously via palm reading. These practices would often lead Christian Europeans to accuse Roma of witchcraft, and from the time they arrived to this very day, Romani have been criminalized simply for existing. They were one of several groups targeted by the Nazis during the Holocaust, but they were not only targeted by the Nazis. The history of the Romani in Europe is a history of misunderstanding, hatred, and violence. I guarantee you that if you look in the comments of this video, there will be at least one person from Europe arguing that Romani actually are tramps and thieves and deserve to be othered. And let me be completely clear here, this is racism, pure and simple. It boggles my mind to see otherwise progressive Europeans turning into reactionary conservatives if you mention Romani, all based on stories and stereotypes that have been passed down from generation to generation. I shouldn't even need to say that these stories have no basis in fact, because judging a person based on the ethnicity they hail from is racism. That is the very definition of the word. And that racism is one of the issues Victor Hugo wanted to address with his book. Consistently, he portrays his Romani characters as people. Some good, some bad, but not uniquely tainted by the culture they hail from. Esmeralda is portrayed as a pure and innocent girl hounded by men who want to have sex with her or kill her, or both. She dances and performs with her goat to make money, but Hugo gives no credence to the idea that Romani practice witchcraft or desire to hurt anyone. Now yes, the Romani are included with the larger group that Hugo calls the vagabonds, being the beggars and thieves who congregate in the Court of Miracles. But he makes clear that this is not because Roma are inherently criminal, but because these criminals are the only people willing to give the Romani food and shelter. As you treat our people when they enter your domain, so we treat yours when they intrude among us. The law which you mete out to vagabonds, the vagabonds mete out to you. It is your own fault if it be evil.
Getting what he deserves. All the nobles got got what they deserve, we wouldn't have enough pillories.
However, there is one instance where Hugo does surrender to his prejudices by making a story point out of the idea that Romani steal white children. In the book, Esmeralda is a white child, stolen soon after birth and raised by the Roma. Let us be clear. This is a blood libel, no different than that which Jews were accused of in the same place and time. It is a mistake for Hugo to have included this element in his story, and most adaptations of the book remove it, making Esmeralda simply a Romani. The narrative wanders between the characters' perspectives, beginning with Gringoire and Jehan, detouring to Esmeralda and Phoebus, and finishing out mostly focused on Claude and Quasimodo, with the occasional detour with the then King of France, Louis XI, who is portrayed as ruthless and tyrannical. Remember that Victor Hugo was writing this book only a few decades after the Revolution, in living memory of Napoleon during the unpopular reigns of Charles X and Louis Philippe. He was not a fan of kings. Anyway, the main through line is that Gringoire, Phoebus, Frollo, and Quasimodo all desire Esmeralda, with Frollo being driven mad by his unpriestly lust for her, attempting to murder Phoebus and successfully framing the girl for the crime. Quasimodo saves her from hanging, giving her sanctuary in Notre Dame. Frollo comes onto her real strong and is rebuffed, so he convinces Gringoire to rally the vagabonds and lay siege to the cathedral to rescue her from the king's supposedly revoking sanctuary. Quasimodo defends the church, but Frollo and Gringoire manage to get the girl out while he's busy fighting everyone else. In the end, everyone dies, except for Phoebus, who marries a noblewoman, and Gringoire, who flees Paris with Esmeralda's goat. And the main point that Hugo was trying to make is that despite all of this happening, Notre Dame, this monument of stone, persists. She is there when the story begins, she observes the events of the narrative, and remains after all the human players have died. Quasimodo's corpse, found cradling Esmeralda's, crumbles to dust when they try to separate the two. We humans are mere insects, ephemeral and impotent, but architecture can last forever. But the funny thing is, while Hugo managed to convince quite a lot of people of his point, honestly we can consider him the father of the historical preservation movement, what most people remembered was the characters and the drama. Victor Hugo was very proficient at humanizing every single character in his book, bad or good. He lets everyone speak their thoughts at length, and you understand why everyone is doing what they are doing. It is gripping, it is emotional, it is memorable, and the most memorable of those characters was the Hunchback, Quasimodo. But we must do him the justice to say that this mischievous spirit was not innate. From his first intercourse with men, he had seen himself despised, scorned, repulsed. To him, human speech meant nothing but mockery or curses. As he grew up, he encountered nothing but hate. He caught the infection. He acquired the universal malevolence. He adopted the weapon with which he had been wounded. Born with significant deformity of his body and becoming deaf during his adolescence, Quasimodo is perhaps the most famous disabled character in fiction. While Hugo introduces him by saying he has a dull mind and an imperfect body, in both the book and in every performance an actor has ever given as him, he is portrayed as eloquent and intelligent. He is easily the kindest and least selfish character in the entire book, the one true innocent. Like the other men in the novel, he desires Esmeralda, but recognizes and respects that this desire is not reciprocated, and is content to be simply her friend. He is the only person in the entire book who actually cares about Esmeralda's well-being. Quasimodo had paused beneath the great portal, his broad feet seeming as firmly rooted to the pavement of the church as the heavy Roman pillars. His big, bushy head was buried between his shoulders like the head of a lion, which also has a mane and no neck. He held the young girl, trembling from head to foot, suspended in his horny hands like a white drapery. But he carried her as carefully as if he feared he should break or injure her. He seemed to feel that she was a delicate, exquisite, precious thing made for other hands than his. At times he looked as if he dared not touch her, even with his breath. Then all at once he pressed her close in his arms, upon his angular bosom, as his treasure, his only wealth, as her mother might have done. His gnome-like eye, resting upon her, flooded her with tenderness, grief, and pity, and was suddenly lifted, flashing fire. Then the women laughed and wept. The mob stamped with enthusiasm, for at that instant Quasimodo was truly beautiful. He was beautiful. He, that orphan, that foundling, that outcast, he felt himself to be august and strong. He confronted that society from which he was banished and with whose decrees he had so powerfully interfered, that human justice from which he had wrested its prey, all those tigers with empty jaws, those myrmidons, those judges, those executioners, all that royal will which he had crushed, he, the lowliest of creatures with the strength of God. By contrast, the priest Claude Frollo is a man haunted by his moral failures. After his parents' deaths, he raised his younger brother Jehan, only for the youth to become a ne'er-do-well who never goes to classes and only talks to his older brother to ask for money. While he is a man of the cloth, he has spent years delving into alchemy, trying to find the secret of the Philosopher's Stone, of immortality. Despite this, he fervently persecutes any who dare practice what he views to be sorcery, and though he has given himself to God, to celibacy, he finds himself infatuated with a young woman whose culture he condemns as idolatrous. He is obsessive, full of contradictions, and abusive of his authority over his brother, over the church, and over the other man he raised, Quasimodo. And what makes him such a compelling character is that he is aware of all of this. Then frightful thoughts crowded upon him. Once more he saw into his soul as clear as day, and he shuddered at the sight. He thought of the unhappy girl who had destroyed him, and whom he had destroyed. He cast a despairing glance at the double crooked path along which fate had led their destinies, up to the meeting point where it had pitilessly dashed them against each other. He thought of the folly of eternal vows, of the vanity of chastity, science, religion, virtue, and the uselessness of God. He indulged in evil thoughts to his heart's content, and as he yielded to them, he felt himself giving way to satanic laughter. Frollo knows that he is projecting his insecurities on those he heaps accusations onto. He knows that he is more full of sin than any of the Romani or vagabonds he persecutes. He knows that he should not be forcing himself upon the young girl who just happened to dance below his window, and yet he does it all the same. He blames Esmeralda for his own attraction to her, for his attempts to kidnap and coerce her, accusing her of witchcraft, of enchanting him, lying to her and himself to try to justify what he's doing, yet knowing deep down that it is still a lie.
You can lie to yourself and your minions.
The final main character, Esmeralda, is almost entirely defined by the men around her. We see her from the perspectives of Gringoire, Phoebus, and Frollo, taking the points of view of these lustful men as our frame of reference for the sole female main character. The only time the story is told from her perspective is when she has taken sanctuary in Notre Dame and we observe Quasimodo through her eyes. For it would seem that in late medieval France, only a disabled person is lower down in the hierarchy than a woman. And yet this is not merely a commentary on the patriarchy of the time, but also a reinforcement that it is only Quasimodo who truly sees Esmeralda as a person. It is only when it is but the two of them alone that we are able to hear Esmeralda's inner thoughts. One morning, on waking, she saw at her window two vases full of flowers. One was a very beautiful and brilliant, but cracked crystal vase. It had let the water with which it was filled escape, and the flowers which it held were withered. The other was an earthen jug, coarse and common, but it had retained all its water, and the flowers were fresh and rosy. I do not know whether it was done purposely, but Esmeralda took the withered nosegay and wore it all day in her bosom. That day she did not hear the voice from the tower singing. The drama centered around these three characters was so popular that there have been many adaptations of the story into film, television, and theater. The first major film version was by Universal in 1923, one of the earliest entries in what would become their monster movie line.
Who is the monster and who is the man?
Go figure. Honestly, this version kinda sucks, and not because it's a silent film. Firstly, it begins the trend of making Claude, the priest, a good guy, and his brother Jehan, the bad guy. This was entirely to appease religious audiences, as even though this movie predated the Hays Code, which I discussed in the Little Mermaid video, it would still have been considered exceptionally taboo for an archdeacon to be a villain. So we get saintly Claude and mustache-twirling, conniving Jehan. What's worse, though, is that this film centers almost composed entirely around Esmeralda and Phoebus. In the book, their romance is tragic, as while the young girl is infatuated with the captain of the guard, he sees her as just another sexual conquest and abandons her when she becomes inconvenient. By contrast, the 1923 film portrays Esmeralda and Phoebus as being truly in love and riding off into the sunset together as Quasimodo dies alone on the floor of the cathedral. Also, this one keeps in that Esmeralda is secretly white and was kidnapped as a baby. Utter garbage! I hate it. Much better is the 1939 film, which is justifiably lauded as a classic. Universal wanted to remake their silent film, and originally they were just going to reshoot the prior movie exactly, just this time with sound. However, during a decade of production hell, the rights to the film changed hands a couple times, eventually ending up with RKO, who hired Sonia Levian as the screenwriter. She decided to focus on the plight of the Romani people, drawing a parallel to how the Nazis were treating Jews at the time.
Why do you stop us? Because no gypsies can enter Paris any longer without a permit. It's the new law.
She also mercifully drops the plot beat of Esmeralda secretly being white. Though she is portrayed by a white actress, one of Maureen O'Hara's first roles, she is depicted as being simply Romani. Also, it seems Levian shared my distaste for Book Phoebus, as in her version, he actually dies from the stabbing, and Esmeralda ends up with Grangoire in the end, portrayed by the honestly pretty damn sexy Edmund O'Brien.
I'll break my neck. And you'll save us the hanging.
In fact, Phoebus and the still villainous Jehan are the only two that die in the film, with Esmeralda getting her happy romantic ending and Quasimodo having to observe this from afar.
Why was I not made of stone like thee?
Now, while Jehan is still made the villain here, remember we are knee-deep in the Hays Code at this point. He is much closer to the book's characterization of Claude.
You're not a priest, and yet you look like one.
Remember that artists have always tried to get away with as much as they can. Frollo isn't nearly as mustache-twirly here as he is in the 1923 film, being given a fair bit of the self-awareness of his true book counterpart. Also, he's made a cat lady for some reason, which gives me an inordinate amount of joy. Throughout these iterations of the story, religion is very present. The book is named after the Catholic cathedral where much of the narrative takes place. One of the main characters is a priest. Another has lived his entire life inside of a church. The main conflict springs from one character's religious views pushing him to hate another character for having differing religious views. But neither Victor Hugo nor any of the screenwriters who adapted his work ever has God appear. Jesus does not come down from a cloud for a chat. The Virgin Mary does not speak from her statue. The gods are silent. This is a story about religion, but it is not a religious story. It is a story about what religion drives people to do and the effect religion can have on a person's life. Now, who better to produce the next big budget adaptation of this grim meditation on the pettiness of human actions and emotions compared to the immortality of architecture than Disney?
Wine, women, and song.
This choice was definitely a big swing for a company that had built its brand on being family friendly, but honestly, makes sense in the context of what the studio, and in particular Jeffrey Katzenberg, had been trying to do during the Renaissance: be taken more seriously. And Walt himself had wanted this. There's an anecdote of him watching To Kill a Mockingbird and lamenting that he could never make a movie like that because it wouldn't fit the image of himself and his company that he had crafted over the decades. Well, in 1993, a newly promoted vice president, David Stainton, suggested the studio should tackle The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Katzenberg was immediately on board with this idea, and he summoned the directors of Beauty and the Beast, Gary Trousdale and Kirk Wise, and told them to drop whatever lame shit they were doing and work on Hunchback. Apparently, they wanted to make an adaptation of the Orpheus myth with humpback whales.
Who wrote this?
The studio would eventually do something like that in Fantasia 2000, but that's a story for a later video. Trousdale and Wise gathered a team of animators and other artists who weren't currently busy with The Lion King or Pocahontas and took them on a trip to Paris. They even found some watercolor paintings made by Victor Hugo himself, which helped inform the look of the film. You know, with all of these videos, I end up digging around for information and often have to make assumptions about the choices made when that information is lacking. Rather than rooting around Wikipedia, why don't I just ask someone who worked on this movie? Would you mind introducing yourself?
I'm Tab Murphy. I'm a screenwriter. I've been a screenwriter now for 40 years. 40 years. Has it been that long? I don't know.
I guess you know you've made it as a YouTuber when you get to interview an Academy Award nominee. Tab Murphy had been working as a screenwriter at Paramount in the 80s when Jeffrey Katzenberg still worked there. And when Jeff moved over to Disney, he started asking Tab to come on over and write for him again. But Tab was reticent to work on what he perceived as children's movies. However, he eventually agreed when a particular project was offered to him.
When I look back on it now, I mean, it just feels like, okay, there was some divine intervention because what they didn't know, I was a monster kid growing up in the 60s. So I collected famous monsters of filmland. Horror movies, scary movies, thriller movies, were all my thing. I was like obsessed. And one of the things I was obsessed about was sort of Universal's rogues gallery of monsters, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, the Mummy. And in those days, Hunchback was lumped in to that gallery. It was like an Araya when they dropped that book. This is why I'm here.
Like Linda Wolverton before him, Tab Murphy was given full rein to develop an outline, a treatment, and finally a screenplay for the film. However, that last step was almost a formality, as by the time he wrote the final draft, the animators had already been storyboarding scenes from his treatment, and the animation was well underway. I did have one main question, however. So, how much did you end up taking from the original Victor Hugo novel, and how much were you inspired by the older movies?
Well, I didn't read the fucking book, dude. I'll tell you that right now. Disney was like, we want to move on this now. And that book would have cost me 6 months just reading it. I think,
Well, not to brag, but I managed to power through those 400 plus pages over 4 days, though granted, most of that time was on jet-lagged flights to and from London. I'm sure having to fit in reading the book while writing an adaptation of it and meeting with directors and producers and animators there would just not have been enough time. And to be fair, the 1939 film does cover most of the important details, and Tab has said he did refer to specific passages in the original book for certain moments. As I've talked about in previous videos, Disney has largely avoided portraying or engaging with religion, being largely secular. Snow White prays, there are a couple weddings and churches, and there's always Friar Tuck, but even he doesn't really talk about specifics of Christian belief, but it's more just a moral authority in contention with Prince John. But now they were going to adapt a book that is steeped in religion. Most of the action takes place in and around a church, and you have characters with deeply held religious beliefs which they discuss at length. But again, like the original book, the film never incorporates any supernatural elements that would appear to validate a religious belief.
That was a conscious choice because we realized if we came down on one side or the other or any side in terms of religion, that we were opening ourselves up to just opening a can of worms that you could never avoid. That's why it's Judge Frollo, why the emphasis is really on discrimination against the Romani people and how he wants to eradicate them. And so we felt those were strong enough themes inherently without adding in a more religious aspect. I mean, the religious aspect that does appear is in the form of the what's the guy that takes takes Quasimodo into the cathedral in the first place. That'll
the archdeacon.
He's about to drop the baby into the well. So that character, and then some of the other. There's religious images for sure. People supplicating themselves in the cathedral, and Esmeralda singing, her song where she walks past all the candles and beautiful stuff. But you're right. It was, we tried to stay away from certainly pinpointing a specific religion and kept it very general.
We'll talk more about how that comes through in the finished film a bit later. Besides being very concerned with religion, the story is also quite dark for Disney, and not in like the grim dark way of fairy tales having toes cut off and people eaten. The Hunchback of Notre Dame deals with miscarriage of justice, religious hypocrisy, racism, genocide, lust, and the very concept of sin.
This material is really dark. It's also very adult. And do I really want to write a story where Quasimodo, singing and dancing and there's animals and it's a Disney thing? And I'm like, fuck, that is just does not feel right. You know, like that tone, it would get me hung at the border of France someday, probably.
Tab Murphy and the others working on the project were well aware of the seriousness of the material, but it turned out the executives at the company were just as aware and wanted their artists to craft the story they felt appropriate.
You let us worry about our brand. You write the story you want to write.
But before the screenwriter was even hired, the music was already being worked on. Simultaneous to their work on Pocahontas, the new songwriting duo of Alan Menken with Stephen Schwartz paired up again for Hunchback. Apparently, the first music Menken wrote was the verse for Out There.
We were about to start Hunchback of Notre Dame. And Stephen listens to it and he goes, "You know what that is?" I go, "What?" He said, "That's Quasimodo's song."
However, while the writing of the score began rather serendipitously, the duo's first meeting with Tab Murphy was a bit more dramatic.
And as I come in on this big wall in the conference room, they have tacked up every page of my script from 1 to 110. And so I'm like, whoa, there's my script on the wall. Well, this is cool. Alan had a pointer, and Stephen Schwartz had a black marker. And they started reading the script from the beginning. They stood at the wall and they read it with the thing. And then all of a sudden, Alan would whack, song. And then Stephen would step forward and start Xing out pages of my script. And I'm like, okay. And so this goes on and song and more pages. And I'm like thinking, oh, fuck, that was like a great scene I wrote. Now it's a song and all my dialogue that I worked so hard on. And they were like halfway through the script. And as this went on, I was sinking lower and lower and kind of doing this. And at one point, Alan looked over at me and goes, Tab, no, don't think this. No, it's going to be awesome. Your words are going to inspire the songs and all this. And trust us, which of course I did. And I would have, anyway, but it was such a shocking, like moment of okay, this is the process,
And who would be singing those songs? Originally, Mandy Patinkin was cast as Quasimodo, but left after disagreements over the character. He would later play the Hunchback in a TV movie alongside Richard Harris and Salma Hayek, which sure does exist. To replace him, the filmmakers turned to Tom Hulce of Amadeus fame.
The rest is just the same, isn't it?
And the animators managed to sneak in a joke about that. But which animator, none other than James Baxter, tackled Quasimodo in what has to be his greatest work? Baxter's Quasi is simultaneously ugly and appealing, deformed yet beautiful. Lon Chaney's portrayal was intended to be hideous, a perfect fit for their burgeoning monster line, but the combination of Hulse's dulcet tones and Baxter's exquisite drawings make you almost forget that there's anything different about Quasimodo's appearance at all. There is an appeal to his asymmetry, strength in his twisted body, and a lot that comes down to the performance. Baxter draws Quasimodo as happy, as curious, as soulful. People with deformities are often portrayed as either monstrous beasts or pitiable wretches, and that is not the case here. Future Weiro here. As I was looking for images for this video, I stumbled upon this caricature of Walt Disney, who had been dead for 30 years at this point, painting a sanitized version of a grotesque beast clearly reveling in his monstrosity. Now, I would argue that Baxter's Quasimodo was somewhere between these two extremes, maintaining an appeal while not hiding his disfigurement. But the more I looked at this cartoon, the more I realized it was astoundingly ableist, that a person with a deformity had to be grotesque, a monster, in order to be true to life, to some narrative written a century and a half prior. I would argue that it is in fact less faithful to Hugo's novel to believe that a disabled person cannot be beautiful, cannot be appealing. Disney's Quasimodo is full of life and youth, not because of or in spite of his disfigurements, but next to them and part of them. Quasimodo would not be who he was without his hunch, or his turned-up nose, or his turned-in knees, and he also would not be who he was without his shyness, or his playfulness, or his yearning. Paired with him is Tony Jay as Frollo, here finally named Claude, though still not a priest. Jay's auditioned for this role was his brief turn as Monsieur Dark in Beauty and the Beast.
I'm listening.
And Disney lucked out in that he could also sing.
I am your only friend.
It really helps that Jay seemed to legitimately enjoy playing the part.
Excuse me just a minute. I just wanted to scratch my head. You are making your bid for immortality.
Animating him is Kathy Zielinski, who is almost Baxter's match in this film, giving Frollo the depth of emotion he needs in order to work. We see his fury, his fear, his doubts, his certainties, and the cruelty of his manipulations.
You don't know what it's like out there. I do. I do.
We will see her talents on full display when we get to Hellfire.
God have mercy on her.
Rounding out our main trio is Demi Moore as Esmeralda. Though white herself, she is animated by Tony Fusil as having quite dark skin, as she is described to have in the book. She is a lot more active and passionate in this iteration, which was a deliberate choice by Tab Murphy, who is glad to have written a strong role model for girls. However, this is undermined slightly by how Fusil draws her, and like Pocahontas before her, she is sexualized rather more than the white female leads that preceded her.
Look at that disgusting display. Yes, sir.
Though to be fair, this is actually plot relevant, as her appeal to the men in the movie is what drives the narrative. The film also makes clear that she doesn't take particular pride in her physical features, being more concerned with being able to earn a living and help the plight of her people. She's not doing all of this for attention, but inevitably the men who give her attention blame her for that.
Such a clever witch.
But the film begins sometime before Esmeralda comes to Paris, opening with a bombastic choir, leading into an extended prologue.
Dark was the night when our tale was begun.
You could argue that this is an even longer cold open than Pocahontas, but here the titles aren't followed by credits, just the rest of the film immediately.
Will today be the day? Are you ready to fly?
And where Pocahontas' opening feels like a by-the-numbers character establishment for John Smith, as well as a waste of time that could have been spent on the native characters, you know, the lady the movie is named for, nothing is wasted here. This prologue is entirely about how Quasimodo enters this story. The English name of Hugo's novel has been The Hunchback of Notre Dame since its first translation into the language I am speaking right now, and yet it took 160 years for an iteration of this tale to center that titular hunchback as the main character. This film begins with Quasimodo and it ends with him, and it is focused on his journey, his growth, his actions. It is also the only iteration that goes into why Frollo adopts him. Even Victor Hugo just has his priest go, why not, and pluck him off the pedestal where foundlings get left. Tab Murphy and the other folks at Disney chose to delve into these two characters and their connection. We are shown that Frollo is ruthless and quick to violence and thinks nothing of drowning a baby because it looks different.
I'm sending it back to hell where it belongs.
And it is only the Archdeacon, voiced by an impeccably cast David Ogden Stiers, coming out of the cathedral reminding Frollo of where he is, that stops the judge in his tracks.
But you never can run from nor hide what you've done from the eyes.
Here, religion is used as a motivator for moral behavior.
The very eyes of Notre.
The threat of judgment, of hell, is used as a stick to convince the pitiless to have pity. It's essentially the Tarkin doctrine.
Fear will keep the local systems in line.
And there are quite a few people who argue that without religion, without hell, without that stick, there would be lawlessness, chaos.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
That humanity is inherently wicked, and that only the fear of God's punishment keeps us from stealing and killing and raping.
The world is cruel. The world is wicked.
Keep in mind which character is espousing this viewpoint, because this film is very clear on its stance in this argument. But the prologue doesn't just show, it also tells, with what I could say are the finest lyrics and music in any Disney film, period.
Now you would add this child's blood to your guilt.
Stephen Schwartz manages to rhyme words I would never have thought to rhyme. It is pure poetry.
At a figure whose clutches were iron as much as the bell.
Meanwhile, Alan Menken is not just quoting the canonical melody of the Dies Irae, but also the text. In fact, at times, his score feels like a medieval Catholic mass, buoyed by a full choir and organ, and filled with Latin and Greek passages from the liturgy. It is a triumph, the best score he has ever written, and in this prologue it is sung hauntingly by Paul Candel as Clopin. The prologue also establishes the main theme of this film.
Who is the monster and who is the man?
Which will be revisited over and over throughout its runtime, but here is capped by the most goosebump-inducing note ever sung by a human being. Here is the first time we hear Tom Hulce's mellifluous voice and see James Baxter's immaculate drawings.
Go on. Nobody wants to be cooped up here forever.
As I've already mentioned, Quasimodo is a triumph of character design. In a way, Disney is here making up for how they have historically villainized and stigmatized ugliness and disability, such as in Cinderella's Stepsisters or Captain Hook. In this film, the hero is neither conventionally attractive nor conventionally abled, and while other characters around him may fear or despise that, the audience is never told to judge Quasimodo for his appearance. And here, in his very first scene, he is encouraged not to hide his ugliness away, but to go out into the world and live life like everyone else.
Oh, man! I thought he'd never leave.
And here we meet the part of the movie that a lot of people dislike, the gargoyles.
So one screenwriter cannot be in 10 places at once, dealing with things that come up. We have an idea for the sequence, or we need to, rework the dialogue to match. So that's when they bring in other writers to do work on character, to do work on dialogue, to find jokes, perhaps.
The idea of making the gargoyles characters came from a throwaway line in the novel where Quasimodo talks to the grotesques adorning the cathedral. In the book, they didn't talk back, but it was felt that this was a good spot to add a bit of Disney magic, a bit of appeal to the children in the audience, and a bit of levity in what can at times be a very dark story. Now, the gargoyles work for me, but I can understand why some people don't like them, particularly Victor Hugo purists.
Look, a mime.
For me, I find the jokes endearing, and they don't really break the immersion all that much because they are limited to when Quasimodo is all by himself, and thus you can imagine that these are just fragments of his personality that he's conversing with, rather than literal sentient stone creatures.
Can stone talk?
No, it can't.
They're also used very effectively to contrast Quasimodo's perception of the world when he's alone versus when Frollo is around.
I think I cracked the code of the movie when I kind of pitched the idea that Quasimodo, yes, he lives in a dark, dank bell tower, and he yearns to, be free and be out amongst the people of Paris. And anytime Claude Frollo appears in that bell tower, it just is gloomy and, like he's just being kept up there, But the minute Claude Frollo leaves, I said, well, why don't we externalize Quasimodo's internal fantasy world? So that when Claude Frollo isn't in the bell tower, it's not as gloomy and shadowy, and it comes alive with the gargoyles, and he has this rich internal fantasy life that is externalized in the movie. And they were like, okay, we love it. That's the way to do it, because then he won't always be, in this depressing, melancholy situation.
This avoids another problem Pocahontas had, which was a plague of animal sidekicks that contributed nothing to the plot and existed solely for jokes. The gargoyles, by contrast, give Quasimodo someone to talk to while he's alone, so he gets to externalize what he's thinking, and they showcase the stark difference between the worldview Quasimodo has by himself and the worldview Frollo wants him to have.
Damnation? Eternal damnation.
Even being told to practice his alphabet shows how much Frollo infantilizes Quasimodo, who is 20 years old, as well as how much Frollo manipulates his ward. We will be talking about gaslighting in much more detail when we get to Tangled, but Frollo is a master of the practice.
And this is my thanks for taking you in and raising you as my son?
This is keenly demonstrated with his short aria, Stay in Here.
You are deformed.
I am deformed.
And you are ugly.
And I am ugly.
Which also highlights Stephen Schwartz's massive vocabulary.
Why invite their calumny and consternation?
Frollo has been saddled with this misshapen creature and doesn't want another living soul to know about him, and so he says whatever he needs to keep the poor young man imprisoned.
But remember, Quasimodo, this is your sanctuary.
Immediately after, Quasimodo gets an aria of his own, one of several in this movie that I know by heart, Out There.
Safe behind these windows and these parapets of stone.
If it weren't for the existence of Part of That World, I would say that this is the quintessential I Want song. It has an earworm of a melody, crunchy lyrics, and gives Quasimodo a strong motivation.
Up there, living in the sun.
And on top of that, it has the perfect flow for a singer rising and falling and hitting the perfect sweet spot for a tenor's belt. And through the whole thing, Quasimodo is parkouring all over the face of Notre Dame, giving us an epic view of both the church and the city surrounding it. It is the perfect song and an incredible start to this film. In addition, Out There, and really every preceding scene, showcases a tremendous amount of multiplane animation, not to mention the CGI flying buttress Quasimodo surfs down. Almost every shot has multiple moving parts and stuff going on both in the background and in the foreground, giving the entire movie a sense of depth. It really makes you feel like you're actually in medieval Paris.
It's like I can touch you!
We then descend into that city where we are introduced to Esmeralda.
Stay away, child. They're gypsies. They'll steal us blind.
Immediately we are shown prejudice toward the Roma, who are just minding their own business, busking on a street corner. Of course, who come along but the local pigs.
Gypsies don't earn money.
Steal it.
Some archer had dealt a blow, or the horse of some provost's officer had administered a few kicks to restore order, an admirable tradition which has been faithfully handed down through the centuries to our present Parisian police. One of the main themes of the original novel is the miscarriage of justice. Book Frollo, after seeing Book Esmeralda for the first time, orders Book Quasimodo to carry her off, and the hunchback is apprehended by Book Phoebus, whom we'll discuss in a second. When he's brought to trial, Quasi's case is heard by a deaf judge. So a deaf person is asking questions of another deaf person, and the judge, not wanting to reveal his obvious disability, gives Quasimodo a brutal punishment in the pillory, which we will also discuss in a second. This is just one of many cases in the novel where a crime is punished too severely or an innocent person is framed for a crime they didn't commit. The feudal system, the monarchic system, which I discussed in detail in the Lion King video, is incapable of administering true justice, and even our current ostensibly democratic systems struggle with that, and a large part of that is the police. They are given wide latitude to use force and even violence to keep people in line, and when they end up hurting people, they enjoy what is called qualified immunity, which protects them from reprisal when they, the supposed enforcers of the law, break the law themselves. Literally, as I was writing this script, an ICE officer shot an American citizen who was driving away. A woman is dead. And while it is too early to know the outcome of this situation, already the Trump administration is defending the officer, claiming the victim was a domestic terrorist. But again, we'll talk about gaslighting when we get to Tangled. It would appear that Tab Murphy and the other writers at Disney were as much a fan of the police as Victor Hugo was, as every single city guard in this film is portrayed as cruel, vindictive, eager to use their authority in petty ways, and sycophantic to those in authority over them.
At your service, sir.
Everyone, except for Phoebus. Voiced by Kevin Kline and animated by Russ Edmonds, Disney's Phoebus is kind of a mix of his namesake and Gringoire, melding their plotlines. The Disney character even seems to be modeled after the sexy Gringoire from the 1939 film.
He's the first Disney hero to have facial hair.
I mean, I guess technically Beast is covered in hair, though he is miraculously clean-shaven when he turns into an uncanny human.
It is you.
At any rate, as in the 1923 silent film, Phoebus is a good guy, but unlike that first iteration, this is not done uncritically. It takes a while for Esmeralda to trust him, and for the first half of the movie, he is a good little soldier who does what Frollo tells him to do.
Thank you. It's a tremendous honor, sir.
Though he does get in one joke that makes me cackle.
Achilles, heel.
It's notable that while all three famous film versions make their villainous Frollo not a priest, only the Disney version does anything interesting with that. The 1939 film keeps his arc essentially the same, with him being a judge being more or less incidental.
You're not a priest, and yet you look like one.
Meanwhile, Tab Murphy's script has Frollo acting organically in his role as a judge. He gives Phoebus orders, he's in charge of the city guard, and later in the film, he's the one heading the pursuit of Esmeralda. It makes him much more active, more of a threatening presence. But what I also like is that while Frollo is one of the more highly motivated villains in the canon, with scenes of introspection really digging into why he's doing all of this, we do not get any sort of backstory as to why he hates Roma.
Witchcraft.
And honestly, we don't need one. Frollo does not need a Ratatouille-style flashback where we see him being bullied by Romani or something, because racism is not caused by trauma. Racism is caused by the surrounding culture, by parents and peers. In other words, how we see Frollo teaching Quasimodo.
Their heathen ways inflame the people's lowest instincts.
We can assume that Frollo was taught much the same way. I'll discuss the theatrical adaptation of this film more later, but I find it interesting that it changes the line
of use to me
to think like me. Frollo's instinct as a parental figure is to instill the same hateful worldview that has festered in him his entire life. This worldview is not based on rationale, it is not based on statistics or logic, it is based on prejudice.
You make your point quite vividly, sir.
The first time all four leads are in the same place at the same time is the Feast of Fools.
Once a year we throw a party here in town.
The scene is actually very important for the history of film because in a lot of the shots, the background characters are CGI. Like the wildebeests in The Lion King, the animators rigged up a few different character models, programmed some possible aesthetic variations like wearing a mask or having a beard, and animated a few different movement cycles. These were then copy-pasted around a scene to create a moving, reacting crowd of hundreds without having to hand animate all of them. There's a particular 4-second clip of a crowd in a Studio Ghibli film where everyone was gorgeously hand animated, and those 4 seconds took over a year to make. The Disney animators did not have that luxury of time, and CGI allowed them to achieve a similar effect in a much shorter window. This same technique would be used in Mulan for the Hun Army, and really any modern film, even live action with a crowd created in a computer, is using the exact same method that was pioneered here. Now the issue is that the CGI characters look very, how can I put this delicately? Bad. They are janky and stilted and need some anti-aliasing, but you're not supposed to be looking right at them. They are only ever shown in wide shots or in a blurry background. Your eyes are supposed to be on the foreground, on the hand-drawn characters, and these cursed dancing puppets are just supposed to be noise in the background. Even now, for me, watching this movie, knowing they're there, half the time I don't even notice because all of the shots they're in were composited in such a way that they don't catch your attention. The Feast of Fools also showcases one of my many favorite things about this film, its color palette. The hunter green of Quasi's tunic, the vibrant teal of Esmeralda's eyes, the goldenrod of Phoebus's armor and hair, the purple accents of Frollo and Clopan's outfits, they were all very distinctive shades that you don't really see in other animated films, and this wide variety of very specific colors was really only possible with computers, with caps. As amazing as Disney's old paint mixing shop was, getting this many different colors on such complex character designs would have been very difficult to replicate with physical pigments. As I was writing this, I was randomly clicking through the runtime of the film to find other examples, and it made me realize that this movie is visually a spiritual successor to Sleeping Beauty. Every single shot I paused on could have been hung on a wall. Every frame is a painting. This is just such a gorgeous movie. God, I'm getting distracted. Let's talk about the goat. As I mentioned before, Jolly is in the original novel. He is not a Disney invention. However, the goat is a girl in the book, continuing the bizarre trend of Disney force-masking an animal side character. I have no idea why they do this. Anyway, Jolly is great. Give him a Lorcana card. I want to make him headbutt Elsa, which incidentally is something you could do in the mobile game Disney Sorcerer's Arena, but they shut down the servers in 2024, and I'm totally not bitter at all. Back on topic. The festival is the first time Quasimodo gets to experience true freedom.
Better to beg forgiveness than ask permission.
He gets to be around other people and see how they live up close. And his very first interaction with another person, with Esmeralda, goes surprisingly well.
See? No harm done.
This leads to him being crowned the King of Fools, using the exact same prop that the 1939 film did. Our boy is high on life, thinking that maybe the outside world isn't so bad after all.
You think he's ugly now? Watch this.
Because Disney dropped the plot beat of Quasimodo kidnapping Esmeralda, he does not commit a crime, and thus is not formally judged and sentenced. In the other iterations, even though his punishment outweighs his deed, there's still the sense that he in some way deserves what is happening, and he accepts it humbly. Here, it is the city guards who decide to humiliate him, for no reason other than their own prejudices and their own boredom.
Hail to the king!
At this impetus, the mob turns on him, showcasing not just another miscarriage of justice, but also the caprice of the crowd, and telling Quasimodo that maybe the world is cruel and wicked after all.
There was no world in a Disney movie where you were going to show Quasimodo, chained to the pillory and being whipped. That was not going to happen. So you had to kind of think about, well, how do we do that scene and it still be impactful?
Tab, you did your job. This scene is very impactful. Honestly, as a child, I couldn't watch this scene. I had to leave the room or cover my eyes until it was over. The humiliation he experiences, the schadenfreude of the crowd, the spinning of the camera with the pillory, the chanting of the choir, Frollo, his authority figure, turning away and sneering as he calls out for help. It is a visceral experience. As I've discussed before on this channel, I was bullied as a child, and the scene felt a little bit too real for me, even without literal whipping, and I'm sure I'm not the only person to feel that way. But it all builds to an angelic, cathartic release as Esmeralda mounts the platform to intervene.
I'm sorry. This wasn't supposed to happen.
In the book, the young Romani girl is pure and chaste and innocent, a Virgin Mary stand-in, and her helping the hunchback who tried to kidnap her is meant to show grace and the feminine virtue of forgiving the men who have hurt you, which nowadays feels kinda ick. Here, she is simply someone who sees an injustice and stands up for the victim. It is a form of adaptational smoothing, a mild Bowdlerization, but it communicates the intended message more cleanly. Now, to be fair, Phoebus also expresses a desire to stop what's happening, but he's still stuck halfway in cop mode and listens to Frollo instead. So does the young Romani woman, the marginalized minority who steps up to perform direct action.
Silence!
Justice!
The single greatest argument for religion is that it encourages people to stand up for what is right. Christianity has the perfect exemplar for this, with Jesus helping the sick, clothing the poor, washing the feet of sinners, and defending a sex worker from a stoning.
He among you who is without sin, let him cast the first stone.
I was raised in the Catholic faith, and growing up, a lot of the other Catholic kids would wear bracelets or other accessories bearing the acronym WWJD. What would Jesus do? A question spurring the asker to correct action, calling to mind a role model who is literally God. And it was understood that the answer to this question would not be walk on water or change water to wine or kill a fig tree for some reason, but to stand up for marginalized minorities and to perform charity for those in need. And the way I was taught, there was no expectation of requiring the people you help be Christian themselves. There was no thought of evangelizing, of being a missionary. If anything, it was hoped your example of being a good Christian might convince them to convert, but your responsibility to help was not contingent on the faith of those you helped. Martin Luther was right about a lot of things in all his decrying of the corruption of the medieval Catholic Church as an institution, much of which still remains today, but Protestants also believe that only belief is required to get into heaven. All you have to do is believe that Jesus Christ is your Savior and you're in, kid. By contrast, Catholicism requires not just belief, but good deeds. You have to earn your place in heaven. You can't just talk the talk, you have to also walk the walk. If you sin, you can't just say you're sorry. You have to perform penance and fix the mistake you made. That's not to say Protestants never perform charity. The slogan, "What would Jesus do?" was coined in English by a Baptist minister. But there is a noticeable difference between how Protestants and Catholics speak about the poor. And on this particular issue, the Catholics definitely got it right. And in this story, it is a heathen who demonstrates this supposedly Christian virtue, calling out the hypocrisy of actual Christians. It is this act of defiance, on top of the burgeoning lust he feels for her, that compels Frollo to order her arrest. We get a fun little chase scene with a couple of jokes that are a bit too puerile for my taste. Though one joke was originally rather darker.
I had her hiding in a basket of severed heads from the guillotine. And for a year and a half, that image remained. And then ultimately, that's one of the images that Disney said, I think we got to pull back on that one. So now she hides in a basket of vegetables,
As Esmeralda escapes, rain begins to fall, and Frollo turns to his disobedient charge.
I'm sorry, Master. I will never disobey you again.
And we get a shot directly copying the 1939 film. Meanwhile, Esmeralda has slipped into the church, and only Phoebus was paying enough attention to notice.
You're not at all like the other soldiers.
Thank you.
They have a cute little sword fight and some initial romantic rumblings when Frollo barges in, intent on arresting her, only to be reminded of the law of sanctuary. This is a very old tradition observed on every continent, predating recorded history. In the Christian tradition, it means you could seek refuge in a church to be protected from the law and its punishments.
The power of the law ends at this threshold.
And for thousands of years, this principle of sanctuary held legal weight. A governmental authority could not enter a church and drag you outside. However, in our modern, secular world, sanctuary is only respected out of tradition. In 1996, a group of immigrants, mostly from Mali, who had been denied political asylum, sought sanctuary in Saint-Bernard-de-la-Chapelle, another church in Paris. After a month of occupation, police stormed the building, breaking the doors and even smashing the stained glass windows to get inside, forcibly removing everyone. Most were sent back to Africa. Many French reviews of this very film noted the similarities between the events of the movie and what had just happened in the same city mere months prior.
What do they have against people who are different anyway?
Originally, Esmeralda was at this point to sing a different song, Someday. It's a good song, and it plays over the film's credits. But Menken felt this moment needed something more high energy with more incisive lyrics.
She wrote one, and then felt we wanted to write something that was a bigger moment, and ended up going back to the smaller moment.
And so he and Schwartz wrote God Help the Outcasts.
I don't know if you can hear me.
This entire scene is largely modeled off of a similar one from the 1939 film.
Give me security, give me happiness, give me rich husband, give me many admirers, give me beauty.
I ask for glory to shine on my name.
Take all I have, but please help my people.
I ask for nothing.
Esmeralda's singing voice is provided by Heidi Mollenhauer, a musical theater actress. Hunchback is her sole film credit, but her work is incredible and unforgettable. While she sings, Quasimodo notices her, and the two finally get a chance to talk. He shows her his Warhammer minis.
It's the blacksmith. And the baker.
And of course, the bells.
She likes you.
More than any other version of this story, Disney's Quasimodo very definitively has a rich inner life, with hobbies, desires, and a love of music. And Esmeralda immediately notices all of that.
I don't see any.
Any what?
Monster lines.
Here we have two marginalized people seeing each other, truly seeing each other, and realizing that there are others in the world like themselves.
And maybe Frollo's wrong about the both of us.
Of course, while this charming encounter is happening, the gargoyles are providing commentary.
A vision of loveliness.
The one in the dress ain't bad either.
That's right, Hugo, the comedic gargoyle, who may or may not be an element of Quasimodo's fractured psyche, is the first canonically gay character in a Disney movie. It is textual. This boy gargoyle is attracted to a boy goat. You might say it's bestiality, but hey, they both have horns and hooves. We will take what we can get. See you in the Pride Parade, Hugo and Jelly.
I bet the king himself doesn't have a view like this.
What I find fascinating is that in this particular scene, that the view of Notre Dame is much better than the view from it. But Esmeralda knows that she can't stay in the cathedral forever.
You've chosen a magnificent prison.
And Quasimodo helps her slip out with some delightful gymnastics.
Wow, you're quite an acrobat.
Thank you.
Afterward, he runs into Phoebus.
No soldiers! Sanctuary! Get out!
But while ACAB, Phoebus is starting to have a change of heart about his position, which will develop further down the line. And his first conversation with Quasi is also notable in that our current captain of the guard has no reaction at all to the Hunchback's appearance. He treats him like he would any other person, with dignity and respect.
To have a friend like you.
With 2 successive conversations, literally the first 2 people he meets other than Frollo, his master is proven wrong. The world is not full of calumny and consternation, but kind and empathetic people just trying to make do and help others as they can. The cruelty he experienced earlier was a mob mentality, egged on by a handful of singularly vindictive individuals whose very job is to be vindictive. Wickedness is the exception in humanity, not the rule. Riding the high of all that has transpired in this one day, Quasimodo sings the short and soft song, Heaven's Light.
No face as hideous as my face.
Originally, this song was going to be another belter, but Hulse had unfortunately lost his voice screaming Sanctuary for a later scene and could only really sing in falsetto, so Mencken wrote this quiet number, which honestly I love. It's just so gentle and hopeful.
But suddenly an angel has smiled at me.
And the perfect contrast to what comes next.
Beata Maria, you know I am a righteous man.
I could write an entire essay just about this one song. But hey, Sideways got there before I did.
While I was in the middle of editing, no less.
First, it is daring. Nothing discussed in this song has any business being in a G-rated movie, and the use of the word sin in the lyrics was one of 2 things that almost earned it a PG rating. They had to increase the sound effects to drown out the words slightly to get the green light. Oh, you want to know the other thing? It's the hair sniff. Yeah, there's a cut of this movie where the sniff sound effect is louder. They had to lower the volume on it to slide under the G rating.
They never censored us. They just said, can we do it a different way?
But where the sniff is barely a second long, Hellfire is a 3-minute song.
The sun caught in her raven hair.
There were times when the directors and the producer and I would sit around and we would go, well, let's run it up the flagpole, but this is never going to make it in the movie. And we'd run it up the flagpole, this idea or this scene or this sequence, and it wouldn't come back down. We'd be like, waiting.
Everyone involved in this sequence, from the executives down to the cleanup animators, wanted to get away with as much as they could, doing this scene justice, being faithful to Frollo's character in the book and true to his depiction in the film. This is a man who knows what he's doing is wrong, but desperate to lay the blame on everyone else, deluding himself, convinced that he has to be a good person when he so clearly isn't.
It's not my fault. I'm not to blame.
This sort of soul-searching has never been seen in any other Disney villain before or since, and the animation is just on a whole other level. The fire, the shadows, the hallucinated figures sitting in judgment of him, and of course, Kathy Zielinski's masterful portrayal of this tortured man. You see the conflicting emotions writhing across his face, in a different man, in a man not part of a strict religious culture, in a man not vested in power that he abuses. This would have been a moment of clarity, realizing that he needed to be better. But Frollo is not that man, and the result of his agonizing is to double down. I was pure. My soul was filled with limpid light. No head was held higher or happier than mine. Priests consulted me on chastity, doctors on doctrines. Yes, science was all in all to me. It was a sister, and a sister was all I asked. Not but that, as I grew older, other ideas came to me. More than once my flesh thrilled as a woman's form passed by. That force of sex and passion which, although in the pride of youth I had imagined I'd stifled forever, more than once has rebelled against the chain of the iron vows which bind me, wretch that I am, to the cold stones of the altar. But fasting, prayer, study, and monastic mortifications again made my spirit ruler of my body. And then I shunned women. I had only to open a book, and all the impure vapors of my brain were banished by the glorious sunbeams of science. In a few moments I felt the gross things of earth fly far away, and I was once more calm and serene, bathed in the tranquil light of eternal truth. So long as the demon sent only vague shadows to attack me, passing singly before me in church, in the streets, or in the fields, and scarcely recurring in my dreams, I conquered him easily. Alas, if the victory be not still mine, God is to blame, who failed to make man and the devil of equal strength.
He made the devil so much stronger than a man.
Frollo then leads Ice out to search the city with a very on-the-nose biblical reference.
20 pieces of silver for the gypsy Esmeralda.
This is what corrupt institutions do. This is what dogmatic institutions do. Institutions convinced of their own correctness, of their own inability to do wrong, whether that be the Catholic Church, a European absolute monarchy, or the current United States. So certain that it is the greatest nation to have ever existed, and to suggest otherwise is tantamount to treason, to blasphemy. We can't have any filthy brown people swarming over our borders, taking white people jobs and stealing white people babies, eating white people pets. It's the same rhetoric that it always has been. What had Esmeralda done? Exactly. She did a sexy dance, interrupted an impromptu citizen's arrest, and publicly defied a government official. That's it. And for that defiance, she was accused of witchcraft, and that official is ransacking Paris to find her. He and his guards destroy property, arrest bystanders, and even burn down a house with people in it. This proves to be the last straw for Phoebus, who refuses to be part of this institution any longer.
Consider it my highest honor, sir.
He learned that the only good cop is a dead cop, so he stopped being a cop. Now, Esmeralda is highly in favor of praxis, so she helps the newly radicalized ex-soldier get away, and when he gets shot by an arrow, she dives into the Seine to rescue him, bringing him to Quasimodo, the friend she trusts. Of course, this was right after the Gargoyle sang a whole song about how Esmeralda was in love with him, like, romantically. The song is... it's fine.
What are you saying exactly?
I know a lot of people hate it, but I honestly find it charming.
Call me a hopeless romantic, but Quasi, I feel it.
I know Lindsay Ellis made fun of it for rhyming Adonis with croissant is, but that shit is my jam.
When she wants ooh-la-la, and she wants you-la-la.
And while it does create a tonal whiplash,
I'm losing to a bird.
it is an intentional tonal whiplash. It makes the reveal that Esmeralda is falling in love with Phoebus all the more heartbreaking. Because that's what real life is. It's finding out it doesn't match up with your imagination. I was a little boy who imagined quite a lot, and still do. I will hold whole conversations and arguments with people in my head, planning out what I would say, what I would do, how I would maneuver events to go in my favor. But of course, other people are doing the exact same sorts of things, and they have their own agendas. And real life never unravels the way you dream it would. The real test is what you do when you learn that. Frollo goes down a dark path of retribution and hate. Quasimodo chooses acceptance and friendship. Yeah, he gets friend-zoned by Esmeralda, but why is that such a bad thing? What's wrong with having a friend? A good friend who actually cares for your well-being? Just because someone doesn't want to fuck you, that doesn't mean you can't have them in your life. Right on cue, here comes Frollo to see this difference in action. Quasimodo, without hesitation, gives sanctuary to Phoebus, and seeing his master coming, hides the ex-soldier.
We gotta stash the stuff.
Frollo, by contrast, duplicitously begins the interaction with an offering of a little treat, only to go apeshit on his foster son, taking his own feelings out on his ward.
Think, boy, think of your mother.
Quasimodo chooses to help a friend. Frollo deceives a family member to get what he wants. Who is the monster and who is the man? Miraculously, after Frollo leaves with his warning, Phoebus is up and ready to go rescue his new girlfriend, and honestly, him and Quasimodo is just such a fun pairing.
No, what the sea looks like from above, and this is not it.
However, their investigations lead into something less fun, the song Court of Miracles. So yes, this is from the original book, but it lacks the context of the vagabonds not being synonymous with the Romani. In the film, the Court of Miracles is just where the Romani live, and they happen to also be the beggars and the thieves. It is playing into the harmful stereotype, and that is regrettable. I will say though, I do love this particular line.
We find you totally innocent, which is the worst crime of all.
There's a brief confusion which is quickly resolved by Esmeralda, who isn't forced to marry anyone by smashing a pot, and the Romani start packing to leave, giving our trio some awkward time together, just enough for Frollo to show up, having followed Quasimodo there. I very much like that Esmeralda does not buy into Frollo's narrative that Quasimodo betrayed his friends, and also Frollo's reaction to Phoebus still being alive is one of my favorite lines in any film.
I shall remedy that.
But now Quasimodo is taken back to Notre Dame, despondent, convinced by his evil master that everything is his fault, and that if he just stayed inside, nothing bad would have ever happened.
Frollo was right. Frollo was right about everything.
The gargoyles, those pieces of his psyche, those parts of him full of joy and hope and ambition, can no longer convince him to act, and they revert to the stone they had always been.
We just thought maybe you were made of something stronger.
What do you do when you lose all hope? What do you do when you pray to a God who never answers? What do you do when you try so hard to do the right thing, and yet you always just mess it up? What do you do when you think you found such good friends and they're snatched away from you? What do you do when authority figures keep telling you you're a mistake, that you make mistakes, that you just can't do anything right? What do you do when you're consistently told that despite everything you've seen, that the world is horrid and awful and that you need to harden yourself and become awful in turn just to survive? What do you do when everyone in any position of authority keeps telling you that nothing can ever change? This is as good as it can ever possibly be. What do you do when you realize that God was never there, that all the priests and preachers and pastors were just listening to cruel echoes in their own heads, and that there is only us, just people? What do you do? What can anyone do? Well, I suppose all we can do is what we can. It begins with Frollo's frothing vitriol, quietly echoing up to Quasimodo, the flute beginning to play insistently, the light of the pyre illuminating his face, his scream of frustration, his tugging at the chains, the sounds of the bells, the very cathedral itself echoing in harmony with him, the chorus crescendoing as the chains finally snap. He leaps out from the edifice on a rope like a spider on silk, and with a swing over the crowd, pulls Esmeralda from the scaffold and returns to his perch. Perfection. When the world tells you that nothing can change, you say, fuck that, and you change it. When the world tells you you're a mistake, you say, fuck that, and you keep on trying. When the world snatches your friends away, you say, fuck that, and snatch them back. When the world tells you to obey a God that sits still in an empty church and never speaks and never helps and always seems to want only whatever the horrible people in power want, you say, fuck that, and find your own moral compass. Quasimodo is at his best when he ignores the authority figure in his life. Sure, technically the archdeacon is the religious figure, but we all know it's really Frollo. He may be a judge, but he's the one who teaches Quasimodo about abominations and blasphemy and damnation. He's the one telling him to hate people who are different. He's the one telling him the world is cruel and wicked, all from a religion that everyone says is supposed to be about love. How can you say your God is the God of love when you won't love your neighbor? How can you say your God is the God of love when you separate families and throw people in prison for the crime of crossing a border? How can you say your God is the God of love when you keep spending more and more money on bigger and bigger bombs to kill more and more people? Either your God is actually a God of war, or you are deliberately misinterpreting your own religion, and either way, you're fucking lying, and I don't have to listen to you. So Quasimodo stops listening to his hateful guardian and starts listening to his own heart. And his heart says all cops are bastards. He's throwing bricks and beams and contraptions all in the name of protecting his friend from the border patrol. And at this point, Phoebus, who has also stopped listening to Frollo, rallies the crowd.
Citizens of Paris!
The original novel is, as I've said, half an essay, mostly on the merits of architecture and why it should be preserved. There are detailed descriptions of the city as a whole, of the Palace of Justice, and yes, of Notre Dame.
Every art, every column, every statue is a carved leaf out of our history.
So much happens in and around the cathedral, and so much time is devoted to describing it, its stones, its arches, its towers, its bells, that it is a character unto itself. And of all the adaptations of this story, Disney's is the one that truly seems to understand this message.
And now he has declared war on Notre Dame herself.
Victor Hugo was not a particularly religious man. He did not value Notre Dame for its religious significance. He valued it for its human significance, for the history it contains. It was built by people. It was designed by people. It is a place of sanctuary. In many ways, it is a synecdoche for the city of Paris and its people. Notre Dame is Paris. It is Parisians. When Frollo lays siege to it, he is not just violating a holy place for one particular religion, he is attacking a place where Parisians live and work and worship. He is attacking a symbol of righteousness and protecting the weak and vulnerable. He is attacking human dignity itself. Now, yes, in the book, it is the vagabonds that lay siege to the church, and it's this big misunderstanding and it's all tragic, but I like this adaptation better. I like the symbolism of it better. The corrupt authority attacking a place of sanctuary and a populist revolt rising up to stop him. And it all culminates in one of the most iconic images in this film, the molten lead pouring from the gargoyles. But Frollo has managed to slip inside, and when he finds his ward, it seems Esmeralda is no more. You killed her. Frollo at first seems to try to comfort Quasimodo, but it's all a ruse for him to finish what he started 20 years ago. Being abused by an authority figure, by a parent, is perhaps the worst thing that can happen to someone. How are you supposed to respond? The world tells you to obey, to listen to your parents, to do as you're told. But what if you're told to let them kill you? Bound like Isaac and prepared for sacrifice to a capricious god. What a fucked up fucking story! I guess the moral is that doesn't Abraham love God so much he was willing to kill his own son? Ain't that so wholesome? And this is the basis of 3 major religions. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all call themselves Abrahamic faiths. They all trace themselves back to this moment, this act of a parent fully willing to kill their child, all because God told them to. I said earlier that religion is at its best when it compels people to do good, but it just as easily can compel people to do evil. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the European wars of religion, Bloody Mary's slaughter of Protestants. Muhammad and his successors were conquerors. They weren't just peacefully spreading their religion across what we now call the Islamic world. They took it by the sword. And look what Israel has done to Gaza, all in the name of their religion, because their holy book says that they get to live there and no one else does, which gives them the right to bomb and starve and imprison anyone of a different faith. Now, I'm most familiar with the Abrahamic religions, but there have certainly been Hindus and Buddhists and Tengri and Confucians who have waged war and executed criminals and discriminated against foreigners and the poor and justified it, or at least reconciled it with their beliefs. The Norse and Greek pagans had gods of war. Hell, Valhalla is only for those who die in battle. And the Aztecs and Maya had gods of human sacrifice. Violence in the name of religion is not a bug. It is a feature. So what do you do when your parent is trying to kill you? You fucking fight back.
No, you listen. All my life you have told me that the world is a dark, cruel place. But now I see that the only thing dark and cruel about it is people like you.
That's it, folks. That's the message. We can end the video essay right here. That's the entire point I am trying to make. But the movie still has runtime left and Esmeralda isn't so dead after all. We gotta keep that G rating. And Quasimodo races out of the room with her. There is a tense chase scene on the ramparts ending with Frollo confessing his original sin before falling to his death. In the novel, Quasimodo is the one to push him off the top of the bell tower almost inconsequentially as he watches Esmeralda being hanged. There's no malice or hatred. It just occurs to Quasimodo to be the correct thing to do in that moment. Here, Quasimodo tries to help Frollo back up, holding onto both the rampart and the man who just tried to kill him. He is so committed to being a good person, to doing the right thing, so willing to forgive that he can't help but hold on. But Frollo does not deserve forgiveness.
And he shall smite the wicked and plunge them into the fiery pit.
There's another great moment in the stage version, where Quasimodo is holding Frollo up over the edge, and Frollo tells him, "You don't want to do this," and hauntingly, the gargoyles say in perfect unison, "Yes, you do." And he lets go.
Small things have a way of overmastering the great.
But in this version, it is only his own arrogance and hatred that kills Frollo, with the sole nod in this film toward the reality of the supernatural as the gargoyle he clings to comes to life and roars at him. But I could argue that's all in his head, one final hallucination as he tumbles to his death. But even with death, life moves on, and contrary to the book, both Quasimodo and Esmeralda survive.
A long lifeline.
Which means Quasimodo can't just nope out. He has to keep living, and he has to reconcile himself with what comes after, part of which is acknowledging that Esmeralda has the hots for Phoebus, and good friend that he is, he embraces the two of them, happy for them. But Esmeralda is just as much Quasimodo's friend, and it's she who leads him out of the cathedral and into the light. And my favorite part of the film, and my favorite piece of animation in any of these movies, his pupil contracting as he steps through the door. And it is a child who steps up to him, and after a brief hesitation on both parties, reaches out and touches his face before embracing him. Quasimodo doesn't need a girlfriend. He just needs a friend. He needs human touch, compassion, literally anyone telling him he has dignity and worth that he doesn't need to earn, that he is good enough as he is. And the movie ends with him being carried by the crowd into the sunrise.
What makes a monster and what makes a man?
If you couldn't already tell, this is my favorite film in the entire canon. It wasn't immediately my favorite as a child. As I said before, I at first had difficulty sitting through the whole thing. But as I got older, I realized how much it resonated with me, how much I agreed with the values it was espousing, how much I loved the music, how much I saw myself in Quasimodo, not as a disabled person, but as a queer one, an ostracized one, a Catholic one. In the end, he is saved not by his faith in his religion, but by his friends, and by his willingness to stand up for himself against people in power. And that is a message I can get behind.
So I'm very proud of that film. You know, I'm proud of the themes of that film. I'm proud of Esmeralda as a strong female character that many, many women fans have come up to me and said, when I was a little girl and I saw that movie, she put me on a path, you know. So, and you know, that's what you hope to do as an artist. I remember I was in a bar with my partner at the time, and we were just having a drink, and there were two guys sitting next to us. They were having this very animated conversation, no pun intended. And I got up to go to the restroom. I said, "Hey, I gotta go." And I went and came back, walking toward where my spot was, and she had leaned over and she was engaging this guy, one of these guys, you know. And I'm like, okay, what's going on here? And I come up, and as I come up to my seat, you know, my partner turned around and said, "Well, he wrote Hunchback of Notre Dame." And this dude just, oh my God, I thought he was going to have a heart attack. I had to sit down. He had to tell me what that movie meant to him at a specific time in his life, how that character Quasimodo, he felt like that character, how that character gave him hope, ultimately.
Thank you, Tab Murphy. You have much to be proud of. The Hunchback of Notre Dame was quite successful at the box office, though nowhere near as much as the prior entries from the Renaissance. Its release was surrounded by controversy, from Victor Hugo purists who thought it was too happy and Baudelarized, from conservatives who thought it was too dark, from religious people who thought it was defaming Catholicism, to non-Catholics who thought it didn't go far enough in its criticism. And yet history could not have been kinder to it. It is widely acknowledged for having gorgeous animation and music, with Hellfire being considered by many to be not just the best villain song in a Disney movie, but best song, period. And its message of tolerance, of acceptance, of disobedience to authority could not have aged better nor be more timely. Like many of the Renaissance films, Hunchback has received a theatrical adaptation, which debuted in Germany in 1999, followed by other productions elsewhere. Several songs were added, and changes were made to the story to make it cleave a little closer to the book. Frollo, finally, is portrayed as a priest, and is depicted as a bit more conflicted, a bit more human. And Esmeralda dies in the end. It's not better, but different. I do like both versions of this particular iteration, and in the stage show most particularly, I love the added songs.
These are the flames of Esmeralda!
Made of Stone, specifically, is one I wish had been part of the film. Now, I can't talk for over an hour about Notre Dame and not mention the most recent development in its history, the fire. In 2019, by a cause still unknown, the wooden parts of the old church caught flame, eventually completely collapsing the roof. The entire world watched in horror as this piece of world history almost disappeared forever. Many wealthy individuals donated millions of euros to go towards the restoration, which soon prompted some rather incisive questions. Why this building? Yes, it is an irreplaceable piece of history, and I've just spent the whole video arguing for its importance and preservation. But this reaction, this outpouring of loss, this worldwide desire to save this building is sadly lacking in many other instances. Architecture outside of Europe, with just as much significance to the local people, is destroyed by accidents or wars, and no one in the Western world bats an eye. And beyond buildings, there are humanitarian crises that are far more urgent than reconstruction of a famous monument. Where were the millions donated to fix Flint, Michigan's water, to help rebuild Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria? And never mind that all those wealthy could write off their donations as tax breaks. Notre Dame was saved because it was already famous. No one needed to write a 400-page novel arguing to save it this time. It has gone from nearly forgotten ruin to the most well-known church in the entire world. It is now a celebrity, and thus afforded considerable privilege. Privilege not extended to historic black neighborhoods in the U.S. that were bulldozed to build Central Park and the interstate highway system. We need to think long and hard about why we consider some buildings worthy of preservation and others perfectly fine to demolish, and why we often consider architecture to be more important than human lives. But do we need religion? Well, Victor Hugo certainly didn't, though one religion needs him. Cao Dai, largely based in Vietnam, has Hugo as one of its 3 prophets or saints, though that may have been to appease the French colonizers who controlled the country when the religion was founded. To answer this question, I should probably talk some more about myself. As I've said, I was raised in a Catholic household. Went to Mass every Sunday morning, went to CCD every Wednesday afternoon, learned all about sin and penance and heaven and hell and all the angels and saints. When I was young, I was a true believer. I prayed relatively regularly, not the formal prayers, but just laying in bed, silently talking to Jesus, knowing that he could hear me, even if he never said anything in reply. But as I grew older, cracks started to form, caused by 2 things. Firstly was my love of science. I was insatiably curious as a child, and I still am, to be honest. But as a kid, I would devour nonfiction books from the library. Books about dinosaurs, books about marine biology, books about rocks, books about mythology, books about history, books about medieval weapons and armor and castles, books about planets and stars and galaxies. And everything I read in science books was distinctly parallel to everything I read in the Bible or heard from the priest every Sunday or the catechism teachers every Wednesday. And for a while, I was able to hold those 2 parallel tracks separate. I was able to find balance in the cognitive dissonance. The Bible was true, but so was science. They just existed in different realms. The Bible was true in church, and science was true, well, everywhere else. And I would find ways to make them connect. God said, "Let there be light." That must be the Big Bang. But the more I learned about the world from a scientific view, the more I began to subconsciously realize that God wasn't present in any of these textbooks. Jesus is this foundational figure in Christianity, literally naming the religion all people can talk about in church, but in history textbooks, he's usually barely a sentence. Oh, there was a lot said about Christianity, the institution, and its impact on the world, but basically nothing about Christ. There's the map of the Roman Empire before Constantine became a Christian, and there's the map of it afterwards. And this whole time, I was being encouraged by teachers and parents to ask questions, to be curious, to be skeptical. And while this skepticism was forming within me, I had another realization: that I was gay. And boy, does the Bible not like it if you're gay. For a while, I desperately tried to find another religion, any religion that would accept me for being gay. I looked into Baha'i, I looked into Buddhism, I looked into Wicca and other neo-pagan movements, and nothing really preached the acceptance I was so desperately looking for. So as I started high school, I doubled down. I became a more fervent believer in Catholicism. The Bible was literally true. Jesus really did all that, so did Moses. It's not a metaphor. It's real. It actually happened. This all came to a head at my confirmation, the sacrament where you are accepted as an adult in the church, where you take a new name. I was then and still am enamored with Joan of Arc, so my first thought was to take Joan as my confirmation name. But I chickened out and committed to appropriate gender representation and went with John instead, though deep down I knew it was really Joan. I was so nervous leading up to the actual event, desperate for a confirmation at my confirmation, some sign that God was actually real, that he was up there in heaven, that he was listening, that he would finally speak to me, that he would fill me with the Holy Spirit, and that I would know truly that Catholicism was correct. So I walked down the aisle with all of my peers, stopped before the priest, and he rubbed holy oil on my forehead. And nothing happened. No epiphany, no word of God in my head, no warm feeling as the Holy Spirit descended upon me, nothing. Deep in my heart, I knew then that there was no God. But it would take me another few years to admit it to myself. I went through a few stages. I stopped going to church. I started calling myself a skeptic, then irreligious, then agnostic, before finally admitting that I was, in point of fact, an atheist, that I was certain that no higher power existed. And nothing happened. No bolt of lightning struck me. I was not smote. I just went on with my life. It turns out I didn't need religion. I went to my college classes, made friends, had lovers, lived my life, all without God. And I started to look at those around me who were still religious with a more critical eye. I saw that every answer a religion had to a fundamental human question, science had a better answer for it, a more complete answer, an answer that did not depend upon supernatural beings or their whims. I saw how it seemed most people only believed in their religion because it was their parents' religion, the one taught to them as children. Geography has far more to do with the religion you practice than any possible truth to it. I saw the superstitions, the delusions, the denials. I saw how believing in something, anything supernatural without proof, was anti-scientific, and that really any religious belief can lead to science denial. If you're willing to accept one thing, say that God exists purely on faith, you are more likely to accept something else, and something else after that. Even the self-professed liberal Christians, the Unitarians, the Universalists, the ones whose churches hang pride flags over the doors, even the Buddhists and the neo-pagans and the animists and everyone else. When you believe in the supernatural, you are believing a lie, and to no end other than the continuation of your religion. There's a wonderful quote from Terry Pratchett from Hogfather, where Death argues that belief in the Discworld Santa analog helps children believe in bigger things like justice and law and empathy, things which have no material existence. Show me an atom of justice is, I believe, what he says. But I don't think that's true. I don't think you need to believe in the supernatural as practice for believing in a functioning social order. Children raised by atheists are perfectly capable of understanding the ideas of charity and helping people and sharing all without needing to believe in gods or spirits or tooth fairies. So what is left of religion then? What can religion possibly offer us? I believe there is one thing that religion unequivocally does very well, and that is provide a community. When you see your neighbors at Mass every Sunday, it helps you feel like part of something greater. It gives you contacts you can reach out to when you're in need, and in turn you help others who reach out to you. And that's what so many of us are lacking now, as third spaces are slowly eradicated, is that sense of community. For so many people my age or younger, the one place we can find community is on the internet, on Reddit, on Tumblr, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And I don't think that's enough. We need places of community in the physical world, not places of worship, but places where we can be with other people, talk to them, share stories with them, break bread with them, get advice from them. That community is why religion started in the first place, to answer questions, and that community is why religion has lasted as long as it has. In my personal opinion, it's long past time for religion to die. But something needs to step up to replace the community that it provides. This can take many forms. There are hiking clubs and reading clubs and cooking clubs, cafes and bookstores, bands and a cappella groups, anime and cosplay conventions. These are at once the new religions and also have been around the entire time. People have always found secular reasons to gather and be with each other. Harvest festivals and year-end celebrations, dancing around the maypole or around a bonfire. For me, it's largely been gaming stores to play Magic the Gathering drafts or board games or Dungeons and Dragons. That's honestly how I met most of my friends. If you're feeling lost and hopeless, particularly right now with all the shit that is happening, find a community. Don't get suckered in by the easy answers of religion. Find a group of people who like doing what you like to do. Find a group of people who like you for who you are. People who won't tell you what to do, who won't tell you to obey some imaginary friend, but people who want to be your friend in good faith. Community is the only thing of value religion has ever offered, and I think it's time we started organizing that ourselves. Our most fundamental trait as a species is our curiosity. We seek, we ask, we wonder. And we need to stop letting our curiosity end at the door of the church or the mosque or the synagogue. We need to ask ourselves why we need a priest or a rabbi or an imam. We need to ask ourselves why we should be looking at the Bible or the Quran or the Vedas or the Avesta for answers. We need to ask ourselves why the supposed will of God always seems to line up perfectly with the will of whomever happens to be in power right now. We need to ask ourselves why religions try so hard to convince us that anyone not of their faith is a horrid and hateful person, and that only through their dogmatic system can anyone be truly virtuous. We need to stop accepting the easy answers. We need to realize that there's no magical man in the sky who's going to solve all of our problems and save us if we pray to him hard enough. We need to start looking after ourselves and looking after each other, our fellow human beings. Not because God told us to, but because we know it's the right thing to do. Yeah, it's scary to think that there's no omnipresent being keeping watch over you. It's scary to think that death is the end, that nothing comes after. It's scary to think that we're just lizards with back problems and anxiety. But we need to face our fears and accept the truth, because the truth is we are not alone. We have each other. And that connection to our fellow human beings has always been more important than the hierarchical institution of a religious organization or the existence of a God. Because God won't help the outcasts, but we can. I am, as always, humbly grateful to my Patreon patrons, including but not limited to Gurgi85, Jinx KB, Savannah Mighty Zebra, Tony Houst, Bewilder Eye, Jekko, Sugar Cubed Glider, Lord Christine, Andrew T, Agent Shifter, Husky Trent, Lemon Lamb Laura, Aspadites, That Gay Duck, Sugar Snap Kaylee, Pandora the Omnipresent, Gil the Gilded Dragon, The Art Gremlin, Acorn Hunter, Roxanne Gilling, Jacob Schaller, Slayer by Proxy, Cat, Brandon Farrar, Lindsay B, Woof Masubi, Dizzy Des, M. Rock, CC Runner TJ, JC Alexandre, Theodore Weirdo, Sam MF Ramirez, Heffy Boy, Brenzabub, Luke Prindeville, Fredo Alvarez, Haunter, Lord Drez, Gabrielad, and Banana Force Scale. This content is sponsored by viewers like you. It's only $5 a month, or 10 if you want me to say your name at the end here. I've also announced some patron stretch goals at which I will make some fun music videos. I also have a Discord server. Feel free to head on over and get chatting with other members of this growing community, if that's your jam. Either way, join me next time as we discuss the nature of heroism with Hercules.